Welcome back to Profiteers versus the People, where we fact check the people who said that they saved the world all on their own and somehow got rich doing it.
Yes, for those just joining us for the first time because the title of this video is provocative, welcome. We're happy you're here. We take people like George Soros and put them through our PR torture test, and then we put them on crutches, our PR torture test acronym.
C stands for consumer harm. R stands for rich parents. U stands for union suppression and employee abuse. T stands for tax evasion, often disguised as charity. We're going to talk about that a ton this episode.
Mm-hmm.
The second C stands for child labor allegations. The H, harassment allegations. E, egregious behavior after hours. And S, slap suits and journalist suppression. I'm Money Mike.
And I'm Rad Bill.
And...
When we last spoke, we fact-checked a few conspiracy theories about George, and we talked about his upbringing in Hungary, which overlapped with the Nazi occupation of Hungary. We then told you about a few of the low-risk bets on which George's early career success would be based, and did our best to compel you to click on this episode by suggesting that in this one, we'll get into the hedge fund stuff. And we will. Let's get started.
Chapter 3. 80s Wall Street in the 60s and 70s.
So, it's 1966. Wall Street is cruising, and Soros is done pretending to be a writer. Time to get back to business.
And as we mentioned in the close of our last episode, the hedged fund, which we introduced right at the very end, was made famous by Fortune magazine. And what year was that, Red Bill?
1966. Don't complicate
1966.
things, Rad. Yes.
The hedge fund, which was made famous in 1966 by Fortune magazine, which put out an article called The Jones Nobody Keeps Up With, which is killer.
A great title. The more I think about it, the more I love it.
I love that. And it describes the hedge fund as an outfit that functionally uses leverage and short positions to hedge risk. Now, in these days, they were usually hedging some sort of macro or market risk. Think beta. So they would attempt to sacrifice a little bit of return for less variability in return and get a greater long-term profit. Remember, our boy George, guy hates risk.
Yep. Not about it.
Yeah,
despite what all the books say about him having this iron gut and loving risk, his whole thing is not taking risk.
Yeah, he is just trying to get the surest thing he can. But as we know, today hedge funds are far more prolific. But in these days, they were just a new idea.
Yes, and George was in. He built a model portfolio with money from Bleikruda and an associate of his in Italy. $200,000 total, or about enough to buy the average house at the time 20 times over. We talked about the whiplash you get from reading A Life in Full, which reads like an obit, but what they do in there is they explain that Soros has this unnatural appetite for risk, and then spin a tale about him doing laps around the planet to make bets as close to absolutely risk-free as he could, as we just mentioned. Well, here is where risk enters the equation, and to his credit, Soros did pretty well. There isn't a lot that we can point to by way of a track record on Soros's Wall Street speculation days, but a document archived from this period, November 1967, the year after he created it, shows Soros's model portfolio up 81%.
For reference, the Dow Jones climbed 9% that same year.
So he's doing pretty good. No denying that. A Life in Full goes to pains to describe his philosophy about the consolidation of the trucking industry and tariffs in place at the time and how that would help some efficient companies win, some others to lose. It's boring as hell. It's a really hard read. Don't turn the show off. We're not going to talk about it. What matters is this. Soros is a good investor. Organizations that make investments like those.
And I will add one more thing. Soros loves to play the players, not the cards. In all of his strategies that we're going to talk about, he's not trying to figure out what the absolute value of something is. He's trying to look at other big traders or other big analysts and say, where are they fucking up? Where are they
Yep.
being too emotionally involved in their bets? And he's betting against that. And I think that really just goes back to his whole core open society philosophy. It's no one really knows everything. People are going to make mistakes, and sometimes they make mistakes in vast enough numbers that can be a contrarian win.
Yes. This is someone trying to do what Peter Thiel was trying to do, but actually pulling it off.
Pretty consistently, which, the thing about contrarians is they're usually right once and everyone talks about it, and then they're kind of wrong for the rest of their lives. Like
They usually lose all the money they made being right that one time.
Michael Burry, I'm pretty sure, just went negative not too long ago. But
that fucking rocks.
But yeah, so like most Peter Thiel types are saying everything's going to fall apart and a broke clock is right twice a day. George Soros is saying certain specific things are going to fall apart, or certain people are betting too much on things to succeed, and he's kind of winning.
He's hitting a lot of home runs here.
Yeah.
So, following the 1967 report, Bleichrude began promoting a Soros-managed fund, which already sounds kind of conspiratorial, called First Eagle, and would be followed by Bleichruder's introduction of a larger second fund, a hedged fund, called Double Eagle, just 2 days later. Because it was a hedged fund, George could invest in all sorts of things and could invest using borrowed funds. Greater risk, greater reward. And he could borrow shares of a company's stock, which meant he was able to short a company's stock or bet on their downfall.
How do that.
Okay, two things to talk about here. One is how a fund being a hedge fund allowed George more latitude. So unlike mutual funds, which by this time had a ton of regulation in the US from the Securities Act of 1933 and more importantly the Advisors Act of 1940, hedge funds were exempt from registration under these laws due to various loopholes that hinged around who the funds were sold to and how they traded. So, hedge fund managers were able to do a lot more in the way of creative and sometimes risky trading strategies, and they were allowed a lot more secrecy. Now, on to short selling. I'm sure most of our lovely listeners have heard about shorting stocks. There's currently some controversy about how hedge funds are using short positions and their effect on the broader market. However, the mechanism can be a little confusing. So when you short a stock, you sell a stock that you don't actually own, hence selling it short. You essentially borrow it from someone else in the market and then sell it to someone else with the promise that you will buy the shares back in the future. Selling a stock long is selling a stock that you previously purchased. Selling a stock short is selling borrowed shares. So when you're dealing with shares you own, you want to buy low, sell high. Or you want the company whose shares that you're buying an interest in to do well, so the share price will increase and you'll make money. But with shorting, you want the opposite. To sell the shares to someone at a high price, and then when you need to buy the shares in the future to exit the position, hope that the price has fallen so you can make a profit. Essentially, you're hoping that the company in question doesn't do well. However, unlike most long-only strategies, when you're shorting, you're borrowing funds for your short, which means that you are charged interest on that loan, or short interest. Consequently, if you make a short bet and you're wrong about the timing, you can pay what you would have made in profit from the stock falling in short interest while you wait for that to actually happen. Back to you, Red Bill.
Two things set George apart from other hedge fund managers. Number one, George keeps explaining how when he identified a trading feedback loop, he could almost feel his mouth watering like one of Pavlov's dogs.
George, Glenn Beck is going to have a fucking field day with that. Would you stop talking about yourself like the biggest supervillain that ever fucking lived?
Yeah, there's a bunch that George says that gives Bond villain vibes. But you're so right here. I can't imagine some hyper-rich, tailored suit type saying this. And I can't imagine a gorgeous dame on his arm. I imagine a mad scientist who is naked under his laptop.
Yeah, the way that George talks about everything else, at least in the interviews that I've seen him in, is fairly cogent and measured. When George talks about himself, Jesus Christ, dude, chill out.
George Soros gets horny about money. No denying that.
It's fucked up, man.
It is. Number 2, where an ordinary hedge fund manager notices a rising stock's potential to collapse and decides to build a short position. George's approach was a lot more involved and required first that he identify boom-bust industries. He would then try to anticipate the behavior of his fellow traders. He would buy a boom-bust stock as it rose to capture the upside, and then would build a short position to capture the stock's downside. As an example, he did this with LTV Corporation, where there was an issue with the company's multiple. It doesn't matter. Though his initial position was likely limited to the funds in his model portfolio, between 1966 and 1968, the stock 10x'd. Between 1968 and 1970, it returned to its original position, and Soros captured profit on both sides of this swing.
And this is the benefit of a long-short portfolio. You can do both.
Yeah, it's pretty good. In 1970, he identified what he believed to be a bubble in REITs and did the same thing. He bought in during the hysteria, this time with considerably more to put forth, doubled his money, and then pulled out, built a short position, borrowing money to bolster his position, and more than doubled his investment again on the way down. Now, during this latter trade, Soros discovered that Bleichruder was using his report to encourage customers to buy into REITs, in effect urging them to be bag holders for George. Though this was unintentional, we in the biz call this sort of arrangement where you buy shares, compel a bunch of others to buy shares, and then sell yours at a premium, a pump and dump, inadvertent or not. As long as George was working under Bleichruder, this was sure to happen again, and accusations of such a thing would have been disastrous for both Bleichruder and George. So with $13 million from the Double Eagle Fund, George went out on his own in 1973 and set up his own hedge fund.
So, curious on your opinion here.
Yes.
Do you think George knew? Do you think he really didn't know?
Yeah, that's a good question.
That's one of those things that, like, the book you read is like, but George had no idea. And it's like, did he though?
St. George, Soros, had no idea. Yeah, both of our sources, they're so padded.
I feel like, this is Money Mike talking about his feelings. We have no data to back this up. I feel like George being honest with some of the less than awesome outcomes with his philanthropy, being honest about some of the learnings that he had early on, makes him seem human, but it doesn't poke holes in the genius. I could see somebody like George being maybe overly forthcoming about things outside how he makes money, but not be honest about some stuff that might make somebody question his genius. So I would put a question mark that George had no idea about this pump and dump scheme. I feel like he might have.
it would have been pretty convenient, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So, alas, Soros Fund Management was born, a block from his New York apartment, which is the dream.
Let's just start a fund in New York just so we can do that. We don't have to make any money. Just
totally. Do any of our lovely listeners have $70 million we can borrow?
We'll trade with about 5 of it, and 65 of it we're gonna have to buy an apartment that we're gonna have to and we're still gonna pay $100,000 a year in taxes. But anyway, back to our story. By and large, the 1970s were pretty hard for everyone, and as such, throughout the decade, deregulation efforts were made to stimulate the economy. The U.S. abandoned the gold standard, and by the end of the decade, major nations, U.S. included, were dismantling the capital controls put in place to inhibit cross-border trading. Now, none of this did a lot to help the general public, but it sure did help George.
Yeah, by the end of the decade, George was doing great. His strategy of riding hype and dumping at the top was paying dividends and allowed him to outperform the S&P 500 every year except for 1975. And in 1976, 78, and 79, George's fund was up more than 50%. Then, at 49, George had an epiphany. My kids are going to get screwed on taxes when they inherit my money. So the following year, 1980, his fund, renamed the Quantum Fund, would be up 102% and would be managing $380 million. Thus, a charitable lead trust, as it's known, was established, which would allow him to pass his wealth along to his children tax-free as long as he gave $3 million a year each year for 20 years. An atrociously lucrative tax proposition for a man already worth $100 million. As a nod to Popper, George called his foundation the Open Society Fund. And here is where A Life in Full explains what started out as a tax break morphed into so much more.
Chapter 4, The Virtues of Horrific Tax Policy.
Indeed, after further reflection, George came to the conclusion that something was missing. He had money, sure. He was on his way to securing an absurd tax break, sure. But what George really needed was a tax break for his soul.
Now, when it comes to government lobbying, which we'll be covering in our next episode, and giving, which we're going to be talking about right now, George Soros, he has some hits.
Yeah, we're really trying as hard as we can to not just glaze this dude up. Like, we were talking about this before we started recording this episode. We can't get too amped about what this guy's doing. And there's a lot to criticize. In this episode, we'll do some of it. In the next episode, there will be plenty more, so bear with us.
Yeah, we have to be as measured as we can be. Nowhere in this episode do we think George Soros becomes the boogeyman that the far right paints him as.
Yep. Now, George's first donation of any considerable scale was made to one of the bleakest places on Earth. Its legacy badly mired by the geopolitical climate of this era and made worse only by its most prominent export douchebag billionaires. I'm talking, of course, of South Africa. Now, around this time, Elon Musk was about 8 years old. Apartheid was still more than 10 years from its formal demise, and its proponents were doing what proponents of horrific policy always do, making modest concessions to keep opponents of that policy at bay. One such concession made by the South African leadership was this. Each year, a few black students were given a scholarship and allowed admission to the otherwise all-white University of Cape Town. A friend of his who taught these students at Cape Town allowed George access to Soweto, Southwestern Township, a homeland or slum for blacks in Johannesburg. And George got an idea. Here's an oppressive system. Let's use its mechanics for a more egalitarian outcome. He approached the powers that be and offered to cover the day-to-day expenses for black students at the university, so long as the program was expanded.
And a ton of George's philanthropy looks like this. He sees a place that he would consider a closed society. And as a refresher, it is a society ruled by tradition, putting people on totem poles, preventing certain people from having equitable voice in society. He finds some place like that, like apartheid South Africa. He approaches people in the system and tries to empower them to make everything better. And a huge part of what he does is donate money to education, specifically to liberal arts. And this blueprint is one that he will use quite a bit. Yep. And I think that pieces of this really help us understand why the right hates this guy.
Yeah.
People tend to believe what's good for them is good for others. I think that's natural human nature. And, looking at Soros's education, that exposure to Popper really changed who he was and probably in his view made him better. And he's hoping that if he gives more people that opportunity, that will have a macro effect on these closed societies. Now, people on the right, I think, would call that brainwashing. It would call it, liberal, collegiate mind control.
Totally. Yep.
And, I think that there is an argument to be made. All right, George, why are we donating to colleges and not buying people water or something more
kind of
discreet and measurable? But we have to think back to George's experience with the broken leg. He believed that people who need charity, if they are given charity, become, I'm using my own terminology here, charity cases. He said it changes the way that the person who's being given charity thinks, and instead of empowering them, can kind of put them down. So his goal here is, how can I empower a society to be better? Again, if you're someone on the right, you might call this brainwashing, or you might call it something like meddling in another geopolitical sphere.
Yeah.
Which he is.
He is doing that,
but
for sure.
He's also doing it in apartheid South Africa.
Of all the places, I feel like he gets a pass here. And again, the right's not going to notice him for another couple of decades.
Yes.
But the school accepted George's offer, but George would find out the following year that the university used his donation to offset their own commitment. The program wasn't expanded at all. Now, I'm going to get big-headed for a second, but I'm sort of shocked by the mistake that George made here, because this is an enemy he is all too familiar with. The founder of the reunited National Party, which had been in power since 1948 and implemented apartheid, was a Nazi sympathizer. This mistake indicates a fundamental misunderstanding of the purpose of oppressive bureaucracy. When progress happens, this sort of bureaucracy is incorporated to deny people access to that progress, not grant it in an orderly manner. This sort of bureaucracy is not focused on what goes into a program. It is focused on the end result.
Yeah, I mean, insurance is so paperwork heavy because your insurer wants as many opportunities to deny your claim as they can get. And this will be one of George's biggest follies in all of his philanthropy. He will keep empowering the wrong people, thinking that they're going to change the system when they don't.
Yeah, Soros is looking at this system as being almost robotic. No money was put into this system because the people funding it didn't want to spend money supporting a large body of black students. So if I provide a cash infusion, the program output will have to grow. It's an algorithm. But this wasn't a program that was ignoring the potential of black students, designed only to minimize the amount of money being spent on them. This was a program designed to deny that potential and maintain the bare minimum number of black students. Black students weren't an afterthought at this school, getting whatever funding was left at the bottom of the barrel. They were top of mind. They were the enemy. His money came in, and the mission of the administrators remained the same: keep the black student body as small as possible. Though he continued his payments to black students, Soros terminated his agreement with the school, and alas, a lesson was learned. You can't change a system while playing by the rules of that system. It's a system. That's how systems work. Here, George made it up in his mind that where necessary, he would fund efforts to oppose oppressive regimes, not just compromise with them. In 1980, he began funding trips and speaking events for dissidents of the Soviet Union, based in Poland and Hungary. He also made visits to Budapest, where he sought to establish an independent foundation, which was against the law, to promote art and culture. The Hungarian government would ultimately allow the foundation to operate independently, but this would prove to be a mistake on the part of the Soviet satellite nation. The Hungarian Academy of Sciences, or the George Soros Foundation, as it came to be known, imported and distributed hundreds of Xerox printers at heavily subsidized prices. Before this act, printers were tightly controlled, a means by which the government could limit the flow of information. In a few short years, the government had lost its grip on academia as a result of all the printers distributed by Soros's foundation. However, as the foundation distributed these printers, they did have to make a considerable effort to appease stalwart party members. Just other charitable efforts, complementary to their party beliefs, etc., etc. Nonetheless, Soros would tout the incredible progress his foundation made with such a modest budget. And I think this speaks a lot to the way his charity works. Again, his investment strategy is going to be characterized by making massive pushes, massive investments. His charitable strategy is defined by getting as much bang for his buck. He is looking for the cheapest dictatorships money can overthrow, so to speak.
Well said. Well said.
Thank you. By 1989, open society foundations had been established in Poland, Ukraine, the Soviet Union, and China, and Soros was giving away almost $8 million per year. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, a calamity for its citizens that George Soros correctly identified as a moment of great transformation and vulnerability. In response, George thrusted his magnificent endowment wherever he saw an opening. He was swift and passionate, and the former Soviet region shrieked with pleasure. Now, he mentioned this at the start of the chapter, but George Soros did a few things right here, which I think do a great deal to differentiate philanthropy from the much less common charity. Number one, a great deal of his investments are anonymous, which suggests focus on the cause. When he does make a big show of giving, it's often to draw awareness to a concern of his or to a particular issue.
Yeah, in 1992, he announced a $15 million donation to relief efforts in Bosnia and shared his concern of the U.S.'s seeming indifference to an active genocide. In fact, a ton of his efforts in Bosnia were trying to get someone to pay attention. And he actually had a meeting with one of the leaders, I'm forgetting the name, but essentially he said, you have to stop killing each other in the streets, because the news channels can't get enough of it, and you're dehumanizing yourselves to the West, and it's causing them to not want to help because it alienates them. It was this really cynical view of violence and like war journalism. It was almost saying like war journalism is doing the opposite. Like it's not shining a light on an area torn by warfare. It's kind of sensationalizing it and makes your odds of getting help lower.
Yeah, super cynical. Hey, all of this dying in the streets that you guys are doing, it's cannon fodder for the media.
Yeah, fuck. We don't need to go into the very complex geopolitical tensions that occurred and caused a genocide in Bosnia. But kind of going back to the whole, like, why does he only give to schools and liberal art causes?
Why does he go into a war-torn region and open a contemporary art museum? Damn it, George.
Which is a fair critique.
Yes.
But during this time, I think it was in 1992, in Sarajevo, which is the largest city in Bosnia, George donated $50 million to fly a water treatment plant in piece by piece and build it behind a hill because citizens were getting picked off by snipers on their way to a well. So he has done that.
Which is cool and good, objectively.
Yes.
Yeah, gotta give it to him. And that kind of takes us to number two. So many donations, and again, this ties in number one, are made with the sole intention of putting the donator's name on it.
Yeah.
And usually that means that they're going to come with caveats. If I'm giving a shitload of money to something and I'm a billionaire, a big reason why I'm doing it is so I can look like a big, smart, cool guy. But Soros, when he makes donations, more often than not, they're unrestricted.
Yep.
Which is big. That's essentially saying, here's money, I'm deferring to the experts.
Yes.
Any donation is nice, but a donation that can only be put towards a specific effort can complicate humanitarian work a great deal. And this doesn't do that. This is how you get a water treatment plant getting flown in on Apache helicopters.
Yeah.
I don't know if they were Apache helicopters, but
I don't think they were. I actually don't remember how it happened. But going back to what you said earlier, that he does his donations anonymously, usually sick, unless you're Marjorie Taylor Greene, and then she's like, he's pulling the strings
I
behind all
know.
of- He won't put his name on anything.
It's a deep state. By 1993, there were open society foundations in almost every single member nation of the now fallen Soviet Union, 25 total, and 20 art centers across the region, which, okay. George's contribution had ballooned from around $8 million each year to hundreds of millions of dollars each year. And his magnificent affair with the region culminated with his establishing the Central European University. One could say that Soros's big money shot pooled in Europe's navel, as the school was located in Hungary. But wait a minute.
Chapter 5. Where did all the money come from, George?
Where did all the money come from? Although the part of the story where the money comes is conveyed first in my source, seemingly as a manner of clarity in the narrative structure, George's best earning years coincide with his philanthropic ones. They happened at the same time. I would submit that widespread use of this narrative structure, which I'll call the implied Bill Gates structure, has had a massive impact on how we judge quote-unquote great men. Like, sure, Bill Gates was unpopular while he was at the helm of Microsoft, but come on, all that's in the past, dude. He's good guy charity man now.
Check out our episode on Bill Gates if you need proof that he's not just a good guy charity man now.
Again, in George's case, it wasn't, oh, I made a ton of money. Now that I can, let's do a bunch of good. It was, okay, some money came in, let's give a little bit. It was a passion project, but when you tell the stories separately, the part where he made the money and the part where he gave it away, as we tend to do with fortunes earned and fortunes given away, a picture is painted in our mind of a man earning a fortune and then having some sort of metamorphosis, shifting into philanthropy mode and making vast donations, almost like they're snapping out of it. And because none of the numbers make any meaningful sense to the human brain, we subconsciously balanced the scale. George made lots. He followed that up by donating lots.
Yeah, it creates two separate personas.
I think, and here is Rad Bill putting on his aluminum foil hat, I think that's done on purpose in many cases, especially in the fluff pieces.
Yep.
But let's get a grip here. What's happening is George is donating vast sums from astronomical winnings. The donations began as a way to offset a tax obligation. And to his credit, after just a few years, he was hitting the threshold for that tax break 2 times over. But they didn't offset the damage his fortune was doing by growing. Not even close. By comparison to his winnings, the donations are a drop in the bucket. And if we're sticking to the bucket of water metaphor, the drops are full of blood. They're a byproduct of his winnings. As his fortune grows, the donations grow as well, but never enough to be more than an afterthought relative to his earnings overall. As his philanthropic efforts were starting, George chalked up his first loss for Quantum, which was in 1981 and was 23%. A lot of investors fled, and George took a step back and focused a bit more on his writing before coming back to the game in 1984. Upon his return, his bets got bigger, more consequential, and ironically, less risky. His first major bet would be placed against the US dollar, and George would describe it as the killing of a lifetime. I don't know why I'm doing the Eastern European accent, but sorry.
Well, I mean, George is Eastern European,
Yeah.
and again, everything the dude says is like it just needs haunting music behind it. It's
Doesn't
fucking
it sound like he's
crazy.
doing wordplay to imply
Yeah.
that he's killing someone?
Yeah, I made the killing of a lifetime.
Yes, the agent is in my lair, in the lava pit with the slowly opening floor.
Oh, George, you gotta stop it, man. But yeah, we made casual mention of this earlier in the episode. And though it may have slipped your mind, George made note throughout the 70s that the guardrails put in place to prevent cross-border currency speculation were done away with to stimulate the economy. The gold standard, too, was done away with. A wise decision with some key ramifications.
Yes. For the first time since World War II, guys like George could place bets on things like currency valuations. And that's what George was gearing up to do. August 6th, 1985, George began ruminating on a bet against the US dollar, which he felt was due for some devaluation. In other words, the US economy, he thought, was overdue for some inflation. Now, characteristically, George owned a $700 million position against the dollar, composed of yen, sterling, and the German mark, just 10 days later, a position that eclipsed the total value of quantum capital by 10%.
This is how George makes his money. Rush in, guns blazing, and his motto was apparently invest first, investigate later. Also, I should mention, though, that as far as I know, currency trading requires a ton of leverage because the movements are so small and so quick that if you're going to make any real money, I mean, you're making 20 bips, but 20 bips of $700 million is
It's good money.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. The following 26 days would deal George a $20 million kick in the nads. He planned to half his position if losses continued, but wound up standing firm and was rewarded handsomely for it.
Diamond hands.
There you go. 13 days later, on September 22nd, 1985, Secretary Baker met with his French, Western German, Japanese, and British counterparts at the Plaza Hotel, where the five promised coordinated intervention in currency markets to help lower the value of the dollar. News broke, and Soros made $30 million almost immediately. The Plaza Hotel meeting ended on a Sunday while markets were closed, so Soros called brokers in Japan, where it was already Monday, and he bought additional yen. He continued building his position, and by Friday, he had added $209 million to his position and had further established a $107 million short position against the dollar. Now, the Plaza Accord was pretty light on any semblance of an actual plan. What George was relying on to lift his bet effectively were good vibes. The strategy was based on his theory of reflexivity.
Yeah, the whole hype and panic move markets. Unless he knew someone in that meeting. I gotta say,
there's that. I'm staring at my tinfoil hat over there on the shelf. And,
dude,
I'm dying to put it on.
Like, I'm not trying to pull a Tucker Carlson of, I'm just asking questions. But
I'm dying to ask that question.
I need to ask that question.
I'm leaving the hat on the shelf. There's a gonzo element to the practice of macro investing, wherein the person betting against a specific currency or for a certain turnout in some war can wind up turning the tables with their investment. Sometimes this is a result of the investment alone. Sometimes it's the result of a larger movement by speculators that the first investment kicks off. This is what Soros was betting on here to some degree. Working in George's favor was the fact that any fluctuation in the value of the dollar would be asymmetrical.
Right. An increase in the dollar's value, and thus a loss for George, would probably be modest. And a decrease would be huge. Low risk, high reward, George Soros' favorite thing.
Yes, so George piled on another $500 million in yen and German marks and bolstered his short position by another $300 million. This brought his trade to 3x the size of his portfolio. Now, by December, George observed that although his principal prediction of an imminent banking crisis had not panned out, like several other predictions he'd made about the drop in the dollar's value, he'd still made a vast fortune off of his bet that hype would rule the day, basically. Soros' fund had grown by 35% as a result of this bet. $230 million made by betting borrowed money on a crisis that never actually came to pass. Now, by and large, this was a crisis averted. If George had gotten his way, he would have kicked over the first domino in a string of events that led to a banking crisis. Even without the banking crisis, surprise deviations in a currency's value can strain markets, erode diplomatic relations, and kick off populist political movements, which we've seen a lot of lately. For macro investors, an advantage of this is that they're playing against a government which doesn't give a shit about the investor's bet, whereas another investor would probably profit via an inverse relationship. Your bet reduces in value, their bet goes up in value. Governments are tending instead to preserving stability. They don't want to get put in a guillotine.
Yep.
Effectively, George Soros is trying to take and sell the casing of a child's ant farm. He's trying to make a buck, and the child is focused on protecting the ants.
Yeah, swinging for this sort of outcome is straight Bond villain shit, dude. Just Bond villain shit.
Straight up. And again, the Eastern European accent, it's almost cartoonish. He is one secret agent domestic abusing women and killing witnesses away from this being a 60s Bond movie. Further, George's resolution to give a small fraction of the sand to a different kid, sticking to the same metaphor, woefully insufficient.
Yeah.
But the reason you don't hear as much about Soros's bet against the US dollar is the same reason that you hardly ever hear about the US's dropping of a nuke on Nagasaki as a standalone event. Was there a huge demonstration of power here? Yes. Was the surrounding culture affected a great deal? Wartime culture for the bomb and investing culture on Wall Street? I would say yes. However, when you look at the big picture, though the damage from the bombing of Nagasaki was enormous and consequential, two things rob it of the spotlight, both of which are closely related. Number one, the process of dropping that bomb by the US was mired in errors. The bomb was dropped in the wrong place and blew up at the wrong time, which contributed to lessened consequences and a weakened return. Number two, the dropping of this bomb was overshadowed by the dropping of another, where the execution was better and the repercussions were far more severe. For the US in wartime, the overshadowing event was the bombing of Hiroshima. For quantum funds, the overshadowing event was their campaign against the English sterling, which came to pass in 1992.
Chapter 6, Playing God.
1992 sees a George Soros who's winding things down. This man is very old.
Yes.
Very old. Perceptively, he's winding things down. 3 years prior, he took a step back from Quantum Fund to focus on philanthropy and appointed Stanley Druckenmiller to man the ship in his stead. His role in 1992 was non-executive chairman. He now lived in London, and at Druckenmiller's insistence, limited his involvement in quantum to offering advice and making observations. He was prohibited from second-guessing Druckenmiller and maintained a small fund of his own to keep him busy, more or less. But Soros would take note of an opportunity that warranted his involvement once again. He noticed that there were tensions in London's exchange rate mechanism.
You see, to prevent vast changes in the value of any specific currency in the EU, a system had been set up where each country was allowed to adjust the value of their currency, but could only do so to a defined degree. If a country needed to stimulate their economy by dropping interest rates aggressively, thus devaluing their currency beneath the low-end threshold they had agreed to, they could get permission from the EU to do so, although this wouldn't always be allowed. The logic being that radical swings could open the door to speculators, like George fucking Soros.
Yes. The system, which had worked well up to this point, was now being tested. The majority of Europe was in a recession, so Britain and Italy had cut interest rates to try to juice things in their markets. Meanwhile, Germany was having the opposite problem. To keep the economy from overheating, Germany had hiked interest rates, meaning their money was at the upper limit, while Britain and Italy were at the bottom.
Now, in theory, the nations could find middle ground, Or their central banks could intervene by buying and selling each other's currency. And though both options would demand cooperation and deliberate action, a solution was theoretically possible. Maybe.
Yeah. Enter Soros and Druckenmiller. What these two saw was an absurdly fragile situation. They saw this correctly. Italy and Britain were in a recession, but Britain would need to be especially careful about hiking rates because adjustable rate mortgages had proliferated their housing market, and applying too much pressure could invite a wave of defaults to join in on the party. Meanwhile, the two sides of Germany were rejoining, and the main focus was curbing the resulting inflation. One wrong move could spell catastrophe for the now much wider nation. Taking these moving parts into account, the two men realized that their coffers might be large enough to throw Europe into chaos, so they gave it a try. Druckenmiller began by building a $1.5 billion position against Britain by buying marks and selling pounds. You see, Britain's position in the EU was fragile anyways, and devaluing their currency past a certain point might just force them to crash out. If this happened, it would be pretty devastating for Britain, but the right bet could net quantum a 15 or 20% return. Further, sterling, Britain's currency, was liquid, meaning you could exit a position against the currency at any time and lose at most 0.5%.
This bet represented half of Quantum's portfolio. It was massive.
Yes. It was Soros who suggested building a position against lira, Italy's currency. On Tuesday, September 8th, he attended a conference by the head of Germany's central bank, Helmut Schlesinger, who said that the country was unwilling to cut rates to ease monetary turbulence for other European currencies. After the conference, Schlesinger confided in Soros. They knew each other, I guess. More tinfoil hat stuff. Avoid it. Brad Bill. Resist the urge. Schlesinger confided in Soros that he was concerned about the lira, which Soros relayed to Druckenmiller. Over the weekend, the lira broke through the low-end threshold, and a 7.5% currency devaluation was negotiated with the EU. The duo took profit, but kept their eyes on the big bet, which again was sterling. Now, from the outside, their bet against the Bank of England looked foolish. Britain had recently borrowed $14 billion at foreign exchange to provide padding to their currency, and the market, by and large, felt that sterling would be fine. Monday and Tuesday, in support of that hypothesis, were uneventful, but on Wednesday, Schlesinger stressed that Germany wouldn't be coming to the aid of other European nations, and after reading this, Druckenmiller decided it was time to bolster their position. Soros disagreed, suggesting instead that the two go balls to the wall. Why build steadily? Balls to the wall, motherfucker. All in. Mama ain't raised no bitch, homie.
Now it's here that Soros's role is elevated from anticipating and reacting to a crisis to fucking causing one, dude.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of the example from like a cartoon where someone's almost off the edge of the cliff.
Right.
Someone just comes over and like puts a little feather on the back of the car.
It goes from betting that they're going to slip off the edge of the cliff to kicking them off.
With steel-toed boots.
Yes. The Bank of England had to accept sales of sterling at 2.7780 marks at minimum, but this conversation between Druckenmiller and Soros happened after markets had closed for the day. So they couldn't go to the Bank of England to sell this stuff. They had to find third-party buyers for all the pounds they sought to sell. And sell they did. They sold billions. The two came back to the office to watch the Bank of England reopen at 2 a.m. their time. The bank tried to fight back against the growing chorus of speculators, but were limited to buying $300 million of sterling at a time, whereas Soros' team had resumed their furious selling of sterling, moving $1 billion at a time and attracting copycats. By 8:40 a.m., the bank had purchased £1 billion to no avail. Here, the Prime Minister could have cut their losses and devalued the pound, but they refused out of concern for being ousted from office. The Bank of England carried on buying sterling, doomed to be devalued for the entire trading day. That evening, Quantum's position was $10 billion. which netted the firm $1 billion, and Britain announced an exit from the EU's exchange rate mechanism, a disaster, by the way, that would come to be known as Black Wednesday.
And it should be noted, with all of our tinfoil hat talk, there's an argument here that this was going to happen anyway. That the relationship between Britain and Germany and the EU was going to blow up. And all Soros did was place a bet that it would. How culpable is George Soros for Black Wednesday? Based on my research, pretty.
Moderately.
Yeah. Somebody might disagree with me, and I will hear that argument. I'm with you, Red Bill, that I think he's kind of crossed the line from profiting off of other people's mistakes to making those mistakes for them.
Right. And drop us a line. Post it on the subreddit if you disagree. But at the end of the day, Soros was made famous by this deal.
Yes.
And
yes.
He was the greatest beneficiary and the most aggressive investor on this transaction by a factor of 4. He's the thing. He's the thing. He was doing more on that. You could say he's front and center in the mob. That doesn't mean he's responsible for bringing the mob to Britain's front door. But he brought the mob there also. Like, his position front and center was not incidental.
Right.
This was coordinated by George Soros.
Yep.
He had friends. He pooled the idea. Was it all him? No. Was he the ringleader? Yeah, pretty much.
I think so. Yeah.
Yep. He made 5 times what he made on the US dollar trade. Also, in reflecting further his guilt about this, he reached out to Anatole Kaletsky, who, at Soros's request, wrote a pretty sizable piece in the next issue of the London Times, promising readers that the crisis, it's going to make everyone stronger. And in fact, in 1 year's time, their income would be up 5%. Don't even worry about it. It's going to be so good.
I promise, babe, I'll never do it again.
Babe, I think if anything, this has made us stronger.
Yeah,
I'm glad it happened. Brought us closer together. A few months later, although he bemoaned the ability of speculators, like him, to take advantage of the current system, a few months later, he would short the Swedish krona and make another $1 billion, paying himself.
We're trying to find the guy who did this.
So we can give him a spanking. By the end of the year, he would pay himself $650 million. The firm was up 69% in 1992 and would grow by 63% in 1993, betting that France would withstand pressure on its currency and on the shockwaves of events like Black Wednesday. Before making the bets on France's currency, Soros called leadership of the country, urging adoption of a single currency and pledging not to bet on their currency, which obviously he did anyways. He'd carry on lamenting the harm done by currency speculators and urge the adoption by Europe of a single currency. A single currency would put me out of business, but I'd be delighted to make the sacrifice.
Oh, George, how nice of you.
Thank you, George. Way to look out for everyone, man.
You've already extracted $650 million out of the economy and did something with it. Nice.
Yeah. Oh, but please don't make me hit you again, baby, because he bemoaned the perils of this kind of speculation while continuing to make a fortune, shorting the Thai currency, and then 6 weeks later, making a bet on the fall of South Korea's currency, although that paid him nothing. For Quantum, this was as good as it got, by the way. As is so often the case, their returns diminished when competition entered the equation. Further, governments caught up, banning bank loans to hedge funds and establishing emergency currency controls. The EU nations also adopted the euro.
Yeah, Soros had masterfully choreographed what was arguably maybe a conspiracy against Britain.
It sure feels like one.
And yet, for the conspiratorial right, at this point, and this is early 90s, Soros was still a relative unknown.
Yeah, people in Britain were not nuts about the guy, but your run-of-the-mill conspiracy theorists, like the American ones or whatever, still had no idea who this guy was.
And if there were conspiracy theories, they were being espoused by very fringe figures. Wind the clock forward 10, 15 years, we'll see very mainstream figures making those kind of accusations, which will be interesting. But I'm getting ahead of myself.
They'll be doing it on TV.
Yeah.
Anyways, in his own mind, around this time, Soros was a god. He was not shy about this opinion either. But two events helped to smack him awake on this. The first was in 1994, where Soros lost $600 million betting against the Japanese yen.
Fuck you, George Soros.
Yeah, nice try, George. Way to go, buddy. Druckenmiller spoke up in Soros' defense to prevent an investor exodus, but still plenty fled. Then, in 1997, George crossed a line in the sand that he himself had carved. He made a bet in Russia, investing almost $1 billion in a consortium that bought Russia's state-owned telephone utility, a terrible and illiquid investment. Further still, he knew of the instability in the region, having helped finance Russia's reformist government to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. He'd at once made a bet bullish on the future of Russia's reformist government and a donation seemingly admitting that it was on its last leg. This is
all hedging, baby.
Russia defaulted the following year, which all signs pointed to, and Soros' personal fund took a 15% bath on the trade. About $1.5 billion had vanished. He explained that the trade fed his self-image as a godlike creature, fighting evil. He wasn't ashamed of his messianic fantasies, saying that by entering Russia as an investor, he had descended from Mount Olympus and entered their world as a flesh and blood human being. That's almost a word-for-word quote from A Life in Full.
What the fuck?
I know. That's a fluff piece saying that.
Yeah, dude. No, like, George wrote that. It got to the editor, and everybody was like, yeah, this is pretty normal. People won't freak out about this.
Let's leave that in there. I feel like people are going to relate to that.
Yeah, they're really going to connect to your godlike narcissism, I think. Speaking of the whole godlike thing that George seemed to be all about for himself, Druckenmiller proposed a better name for Black Wednesday, the name given to the British currency crisis that Soros may or may not have caused. We talked about it earlier. And this is a direct quote from A Life in Full. The devaluation had restored Britain's monetary freedom. It was White Wednesday.
God. Oh my God. This is what the Bond villain does at the end when he successfully kills the secret agent. He goes, in a way, I was the real hero. Anyways.
Yikes.
Yikes indeed. Thanks for listening, everyone. In the next episode, we'll get to his political involvement and the part where the conspiratorial right finally takes notice. Like, comment, subscribe. We love you. And goodbye.
Goodbye.